Lanka, you just need to unmute yourself.
Sorry. Hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to today's discussion on gender justice in garment supply chains. This is the 107th session of LUMS Live. I'm Nandita, the campaign's coordinator at Asia Floor Wage Alliance. We are an Asian alliance of trade unions and labor rights organizations working to address poverty-level wages, gender-based violence, and freedom of association in garment supply chains. And I'm joined here today by an incredible panel of women researchers and labor practitioners who have worked on gender and labor issues in garment supply chains. We have with us Abida Ali, who's a political activist, organizer, and the Pakistan coordinator of Aqua. Abhirami Shivaloganathan, who's a gender trainer and also works as the Sri Lanka coordinator of Aqua. Ashley Saxby, who's the Gender Justice Program coordinator of Aqua and also coordinates Aqua's work in Southeast Asia. And also Ashmita Sharma, a researcher and Chief Functionary Officer at the labor rights organization, Society for Labor and Development in India. Thank you all for joining me here today. Before we begin, I want to say we're really grateful to the Saida Waid Gender Initiative at the Lahore University of Management Science for this important opportunity to discuss the issues faced by women garment workers who produce the clothes that all of us wear every day. Platforms like this are very important as they bring together researchers, labor practitioners, and consumers of fashion so that we can think and share ideas on how all of us can work together to advance gender justice, especially in women-dominated sectors like the garment industry. So thank you once again for this opportunity. I also want to say some of the discussions we'll be having today might be triggering for some of the audience, especially as we will be discussing topics like sexual harm and violence. If you feel this discussion may be triggering, please do feel free to leave. And I really hope today, as we have these difficult but important conversations, we can create an atmosphere of mutual respect and sensitivity. Today's session is divided into 3 parts. In the first part, we'll try to understand how pervasive the issue of gender-based violence is in garment supply chains and the factors that are driving it. In the second, we will discuss how Gbbh in garment supply chains worsened during the pandemic. And in the third, we'll discuss the urgent actions required to prevent and remediate Gbbh in garment supply chains. But before I get into today's discussion on Gbbh, I want to put out some facts that will give you a sense of the importance of the garment industry for both women's employment and also for the economic development of Asia as a region. The garment sector accounts for about 4% of the total employment in Asia and is one of the largest women-dominated sectors, employing more than 60 million women workers. This sector is so women-dominated that 1 in 5 women in Cambodia and 1 in 7 women in Sri Lanka and Pakistan and 1 in every 9 women in Bangladesh and Myanmar are all employed in this industry. And also, importantly, 75% of the garment workers worldwide are employed in Asia. So Asia is, as a region, the hub of global garment production. The sector is also very important for the GDP of many Asian countries. In Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Cambodia, this industry accounts for about 10% of the GDP. Also, in countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Cambodia, 70 to 80% of total exports are from the garment sector. So I hope these numbers provide you a sense of how important this industry is for Asian countries and particularly women workers. With this being said, I would like to move to my first question, which is for Abhirami, the Sri Lanka country coordinator of Aqua. Abhirami, you've been looking at this sector for a very long time, and you worked as an organizer and a gender trainer who's also been part of a lot of research on gender-based violence in the garment industry. Can you tell us, first of all, what is gender-based violence, particularly in the context of the garment industry? What are the various forms in which it exists? And how pervasive is this problem of gender-based violence in Asian garment supply chains?
Yeah, thank you, Nandita, for the floor. So gender-based violence occurs in the context where a person's gender has a direct impact on how they are treated, be it at home, workplace, and the community. So when considering the garment industry as a whole, gender-based violence is a commonplace considering that the workforce involves majority women, and also due to the patriarchal structure that we live in right now, and the notions and the cultural values that are prevalent in Asian communities where the garment producing countries are located. So a number of forms of gender-based violence exist within the garment supply chain, ranging from mental, physical, and verbal abuse spread across from the production floors. So workers, it appears in the community and their household also. So the hierarchical power structure directly play a role in this violence, where the male-dominated supervisory roles inflict harm on the blue-collar factory workers who are majority women. So this practice is carried out with the idea and the objective of meeting production targets and low production cost. So in order to cater to global brands who, if not for these exploitative practice that will increase their revenues, will move on their business to more profitable producers. So the majority workforce in the garment sector is made up of migrant workers. We can take an example from Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, like most of the countries, like we have migrant and workers who work on a temporary basis, and then it applies across Asia. So this places them at a high risk as they are employed away from their homes, and also as temporary workers. Many labor-related laws become irrelevant to them, like when they are as a migrant worker, so leaving them exposed to extreme violence. So, like they are overworkers, underpaid, and have limited social benefit to enjoy. So being employed in the garment industry means steady working hours and overtime work as well. So in patriarchal societies, this is not a desirable situation where the household tasks are also expected to be done by the women. When these expectations are not met, it leads to various forms of physical, mental, and verbal abuse, where these actions may be rationalized due to the impressions that regardless of earnings, the man will always be considered the breadwinner of the family. So therefore, Asia Flowage Alliance, we usually consider gender-based violence in a broader broader way, which includes, as I mentioned, mental, physical, and verbal. And then we also look at the spectrum of violence when garment workers experience this violence just because of their gender, just because they are a woman. So we largely look at this gender-based violence and harassment in the garment sector, and then we set our work towards that goal. So we also need to ensure that when we look at the gender-based violence in general, violence and the harassment in general, we always need to address this verbal, physical, and mental abuses as well. Yeah, Nandita, over to you.
Thank you, Abhirami, for that detailed explanation on gender-based violence. Abhirami has raised some very important points, which I'd like to reiterate. Firstly, she told us that gender-based violence includes violence directed against a woman because she's a woman, and violence which disproportionately affects women. Secondly, she told us about a spectrum of gender-based violence which exists in garment supply chains. And thirdly, she told us how rampant the issue of Gbbh is across garment factories, across all Asian garment factories, and that this is not a problem linked to a single country or a single brand or a single factory. And this brings me to my second question, which is directed at Abida Ali, the Pakistan coordinator of Aqua. Abida, can you tell me why is gender-based violence so rampant in garment supply chains? And what are the factors that are driving it across all these countries?
Thank you, Nandita, for giving me floor. So you see, the problem is in the current structure of global garment supply chains and the purchasing practices of the apparel brands. So the current structure is so asymmetrical and unregulated that it allows brands to control the consumer market in the developed economies, where they sell the garments at high prices, and at the same time they control the labor markets in the developing economies, from where they push down the labor costs through wage theft and gender based violence. You see, so and also the brands falsely project themselves as buyer rather than as employer of the workers in their supply chains, which creates an intense competition between the suppliers and governments to push down labor costs to retain the businesses of the brands. So firstly, this is the reason. So consequently, the governments in production countries are forced to compete with one another by setting minimum wage at the lowest level, weakening labor protection, and practicing poor labor enforcement of the laws in order to attract the business of the brands. So this intense competition between supplier to retain the order of the brand by pushing down production costs forced them to take retaliatory measures, which led to high pressure work environment in which the management, who are typically men, employ tactics like bullying, abuse, and harassment to speed up the work process and discipline the predominantly female workers. And also at the same time, brands also rely on the existing inequalities and secondary position of women in the society to keep costs low and make super profit by paying them poverty level wages. Therefore we have seen that during pandemic, when brands in the global north cancelled order worth millions of dollars and demanded discounts to protect their profit, they placed downward pressure on the suppliers in the global south. Consequently, the women workers who were already disproportionately at lower level found their survivals and that of their family in extreme jeopardy. So I think these are the reasons that lead to an increase in gender based violence in global supply chain.
Thank you, Abida, for that response. I think it is very important that we understand the fundamental factors driving GBVH in garment factories across Asia, which, as Abida said, is very much linked to the purchasing practices or the economic behavior of fashion brands, which take advantage of the existing patriarchal social norms and make women vulnerable to physical, verbal, and sexual violence. And this brings me to my third question, which is for Ashley, the Gender Justice Program Coordinator at Aqua. Ashley, the tremendous efforts of labor rights activists and researchers and the consumer-driven accountability movements in Europe and the US, this has made a lot of people realize the linkage between brand actions and gender-based violence in Asian garment factories. And responding to this, we've seen brands develop, corporate social responsibility, CSR codes of conduct, where they speak about various social and environmental principles based on which they conduct their business. They've also started these labor audits, so in other words, inspections of their Asian garment factories with the intent of detecting GBVH and other labor and environmental violations. From your experience, how successful have these efforts been in addressing and remediating gender-based violence in garment factories?
Yeah, thanks, Nandita. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, so yeah, to be frank, unfortunately, CSR codes of conduct, social audits, inspections, have not really been successful at all in addressing gender-based violence. How do we know this? I mean, the most obvious examples, we can look at tragedies like Rana Plaza, where over 1,000 workers, mostly women, were killed, and more than 2,000 more were very badly injured. In Pakistan, the Ali Enterprises fire that took over 250 lives. Nachi Apparels in Tamil Nadu, where a young woman, Jayasri, was raped and murdered just last year. I mean, all these factories were audited. So, I mean, these three examples alone show us that voluntary codes of conduct have really just failed miserably to the extent that, workers have been killed. And we see continued evidence of gender-based violence in supplier factories where these codes of conduct are supposedly implemented. So, I mean, we can safely say that this has been a failed approach. So, on the one hand, we see how these codes are adopted by global buyers in response to public criticism of things like, poor working conditions. So it's arguable that the main purpose is really to legitimize businesses or to rehabilitate brand images, right? So, because we see that social audits are also used to cover up violations, because we know that workers face massive intimidation and threats of losing their job and retaliation from employers in supplier factories. So then, why is this? I mean, to put it succinctly, the threat of brands to relocate, sourcing their orders, it's like, as Abida had mentioned, it causes this intense competition where suppliers have to drive down the cost of labor, which means squeezing the workers. And, this doesn't happen only through bringing down wages, but also by speeding up the work process to meet higher production targets. And, gender-based violence is one of the main ways that bosses will do this. And at the same time, suppliers have to maintain this flexible workforce, things like short-term contracts, manpower dispatch agencies, so that they can kind of conveniently hire and fire workers to match order fluctuations and also, maintain their very thin profit margins. So this job insecurity that's created really increases vulnerability to gender-based violence and really, serves to deter women from reporting in the first place. So while brands are saying that, they ensure that their suppliers have to honor these codes of conduct, I mean, they're really just creating this very contradictory environment where wealth and power is concentrated in the hands of the buyers. And then, the business models are just, they have this immense control over suppliers and the way they operate. So working conditions are degraded almost out of necessity. And, on the other hand, these codes of conduct really fail to address the unequal power relations, and they really serve to, exclude women from participating in these processes that, attempt to address human rights violations, labor rights violations. So, looking at one key aspect, we can look at freedom of association, because we know that unionization in factories is really challenging for garment workers. I mean, union busting is so prevalent, and we know that that gender-based violence is one of the core impediments to to organizing and union building in the first place. So on the one hand, gender-based violence has to be eliminated in order for women to claim their rights, but at the same time, we know that unions are so important for workers to be able to improve their conditions. And trade unions and women's leadership are essential for preventing and eliminating violence in the workplace. And without organizing, it's really difficult for women to access their rights. So that's why things like shop floor monitoring, grievance mechanisms at the factory level that are really implemented and accessible to women workers, they're so important. And instead of voluntary codes of conduct, we really need mandatory mechanisms that bind brands, through liability that's in their contracts with suppliers. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ash. You raised a very important point. CSR and social audits are insufficient. They're an insufficient approach, as they fail to address power imbalances in the factory floor and the fear of retaliation among workers, especially when they make complaints of sexual harassment, and which is very critical. Addressing this fear of retaliation is very critical to Gbbh reporting. And if they are failing to do that, then they do not help in transforming the workplace. So thank you, Ashley, for that response. To our audience here, I hope the discussion so far has helped you understand how pervasive gender-based violence is, the factors driving it, and how brand efforts such as CSR initiatives and audits have been ineffective in addressing GBVH. If you have any questions related to what we've discussed so far, please do put it in the chat. We will take it up after this discussion. Now I really want to discuss about the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on gender-based violence in garment supply chains. And I want to go back to Abhirami. Abhirami, from what you've seen in your home country, Sri Lanka, and across Asia, can you tell us what has been the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on women garment workers? And has it really increased women garment workers' vulnerability to violence?
Yeah, thank you again, Nandita. Of course, like the vulnerability has really increased, and then it's really put on pressure on the garment workers these days, not only in Sri Lanka but across Asia. So this COVID-19 has indeed, like as I mentioned, increased women garment workers' vulnerability to violence. So in the Sri Lankan context, the garment industry was catalyst to the largest COVID outbreak in Sri Lanka, where thousands of workers were impacted and affected the garment industry as a whole. So these workers had to face many forms of violence, even those precipitated by the general public, as they were considered as individuals who are responsible for the spreading the virus. This just because like the second wave of COVID outbreak took place in one of the biggest apparel factory in Sri Lanka, which we call Brandtech. So I hope most of you are aware that this factory was the initial cost of outbreak of the in the garment sector of the COVID. And then when workers initially showed symptoms and then unable to report back to the work, but then the management denied their leaves and then forced the workers to come to the work because they need to meet the target on time, and then you need to run the production. So I mean, like this is it's not a good example. I mean, it's not a good scenario, but then it's a valid example how garment women workers treated during the COVID pandemic. So these workers had to face, very when they had a crucial time, and then a negative response from the public as well in Sri Lanka. So and when it's come to the accommodation arrangements for all the workers, that played an important role in the adverse effects that women garment workers had to face. So most of the time, 5 to 6 garment workers share an accommodation unit, and this means using the same washroom facilities and other access necessary things that spread the virus. So when the country-wide lockdown periods also severely impacted the garment workforce, and their wages were reduced, and some of them could not return back to work due to the inability of means to their travel in their rented out accommodation spaces and other public spaces, they had to face various form of violence as well. I mean, if these all the cases that we actually captured in our gender-based violence report that we recently published. And when women workers were unable to pay their monthly rent due to lack of income, the landlord would unnecessarily ban to their rooms and demand for their rent, or pressure them to come to other arrangements. So when I mean other arrangements, that's actually lead to the physical harassment in settling their dues. So this was the case even when workers could not afford basic necessity and had to bear certain suggestive comments made by shop owners, and then some other public. So, I mean, this actually like unnecessarily striping away their dignity, right? I mean, they are workers, humans, and people like us, like, and within factory premises, workers had to work overtime without pay to meet company demands and to protect their job regardless of their illegal labor practices. So laying off permanent workers and hiring temporary workers was another tactic practiced by employers so that they can further reduce production cost and earn more revenue at the cost of workers' mental and physical well-being. And I'm saying this all is not only applicable to Sri Lanka. I mean, like our research and our Asia Flow, which reports, like lined up and saying that it's not only in Sri Lanka, it's across the Asia during the pandemic. So women had to face violence perpetrated by their own family members for not being able to carry out the traditional duties expected from a mother, wife, or daughter in the context where they had to balance all the household work while being the main income earner for the family as well. So when I was giving the example of Sri Lanka, how women workers were treated, it's also applicable to the Pakistan cases. I hope Abita wouldn't be, she will be also like, agree with what I'm saying right now, because the workers had to sell their own doors or the properties that they have to eat for one time. So these kind of hard situation that they have to go through. Just this all the pandemic has brought up to the situation. Yeah.
Thank you, Abirami, for informing us in such detail the crisis faced by women garment workers during the pandemic. The pandemic was a time when we saw mega fashion brands and retailers like Amazon making super profits. And yet we had the women workers who are working 11 plus hours for them pre-pandemic, reducing their consumption, taking on huge debts, and selling their meager assets just to survive. And this is also a great example of how wealth inequalities are on a rise during the pandemic. And this brings me to my next question, which is for Ashmita, who was a lead researcher for the report that Abrami was mentioning. Aqua's latest research report, A Stitch in Time, Save None, which documents in detail how fashion brands accentuated Gbbh in garment supply chains during pandemic. Ashmita, I want to discuss some of the key points which were raised in this report with you. For me personally, two important things were being raised by the report. One, the wage theft of women garment workers during the pandemic increased women garment workers' vulnerability to violence. Secondly, the poverty level wages in this women dominated sector in the pre-pandemic period was a major contributor that increased women's vulnerability to Gbbh. Can you elaborate more on these points and tell us the link between economic harm and the everyday violence that women garment workers experience, especially during times like the COVID-19 pandemic?
Thank you, Nandita, for your question. In order to understand, economic harm as a form of GBVH, we need to locate the experiences of violence that women workers face at the intersection of brand purchasing practices, restrictions imposed by supplier factories, and the inevitable consequences faced by women workers in the garment supply chains. So brand actions during the pandemic, determined how certain kinds of restrictions were imposed by supplier factories and how women in that very chain experienced different forms of violence in the global supply chain. GBVH, as the study that we did in 6 different countries, showed us that it is endemic to the garment industry, and it is also a very central aspect of business model of global apparel brands, and just not an unintended consequence of the COVID-19 crisis. Asymmetrical power relations between apparel brands in the global north and suppliers in the global south are such that brands are able to dictate the terms of production in terms of demanding higher production targets at ever lower rates. However, this kind of power imbalance also is pervasive within supplier factories existing between the management at the top and the workers at the lower rung of the hierarchy, where the management is able to employ certain tactics like bullying, harassment, different forms of abuse, not only to speed up work process, but also to control and discipline the predominantly female workforce. So therefore, an already aggravated work situation in the supplier factories is further was further aggravated as a result of the COVID-19 crisis, where women who were working under extremely precarious employment situations in supplier factories, which restricted their ability to talk about various forms of violence, in open forums. For example, I would like to give an example where we saw that when a supervisor touched, say, a woman worker, because she was already dependent on extremely low wages for her survival as well as the survival of her family, she did not have the courage to actually complain when confronted with violence for the fear of losing her job. So we see how Gbbh is also a consequence of economic exploitation faced by women workers in the factories. Here we also see how brands rely on the secondary position of women workers in the society in order to keep cost low, as well as amass super profits by paying poverty level wages. And there was, like you rightly pointed out, there was widespread wage theft during the pandemic, and women who were already disproportionately affected at poverty level wages for their survival were under extremely distressful situations. So therefore, so wage theft basically committed by brands during the pandemic impacted workers, women workers in different ways. Suppliers, they leveraged the pre-existing gender gap, hiring or retaining women workers for low wage rates during the periods of lockdown, whereas laying off men whose wages were higher. So men were more likely to be rehired, in the post-lockdown situations, while the reduction in the number of work days was more severe for women. And also there was, intensification of work due to the reduction of the workforce, and increased work targets, like I had mentioned, had serious repercussions for women workers in production lines. So economic harm, like I said, imposed by brands, led to a ripple effect of different forms of violence experienced by workers in different domains, like within the factory walls, as well as in workers' homes, as well as in the communities. Women's unpaid domestic and care work increased during the pandemic, which was compounded by a lack in employer-based, social protection and social services. Women were forced to reduce their consumption, take on huge debts, as well as sell meager assets, leading to a situation of malnutrition, hunger, as well as bodily neglect. So, and women were also exposed to increased forms of violence in the homes. Like there was an increase in, we saw an increase in domestic violence in the homes, in familial homes, as well as in employer-provided factory dorms and boarding houses, perpetrated by employers, landlords. So therefore we see how, economic harm basically had a cascading effect on different forms of violence that women faced in different domains in their lives. So while there was, there's no, concrete definition of what constitutes economic harm. given the widespread, wage theft that disproportionately impacted women workers and its effects, we thought that this was an important area of exploration, and therefore this came up as an important area of discussion as well after the report was released. And brands purchasing practices created the conditions for long-standing GBBH that predated the pandemic, and their irresponsible actions in the context of COVID-19 to a number of deeply gendered economic-based phenomena that inflicted immense harm on women workers. And these are some of the aspects that the report elaborates, citing economic harm as an important and as an inconspicuous form of GBVH. Over to you, Nandita.
Thank you, Ashmita. Really, that's a very important, point that you've raised. And as all of you've heard from Ashmita, the economic harm imposed by brands, particularly during the pandemic, it led to a ripple effect of different forms of violence experienced by women workers in their homes, families, and communities. And it is also important to realize that if brands had paid a living wage to their women workers in the pre-pandemic period, which is not a difficult thing for big fashion brands to do given their extremely high profits, women workers in Asia would not have been pushed to destitution and could have actually had the capacity to deal with this pandemic. And this is why I believe fashion brands have some degree of culpability in the crisis that we saw women garment workers go through during this pandemic. Now I want to move back to Ashley, who is also very closely involved in developing this research report, A Stitch in Time, Save None. Ashley, for me, the report introduces two very important concepts. One is embodied trauma, and the other is the concept of garment industrial trauma complex. These two terms, they capture the experience of women garment workers, and they provide us the language to understand the crisis which women garment workers experience. Can you elaborate more on these concepts, what they mean, and how did you come to this understanding?
Sure, yeah, thanks. So in the research, we found so many instances of mental health issues like depression and even, suicidal thoughts. And what many women expressed in their day-to-day work experiences, which really increased during the pandemic, was this sense of trauma coming from, this constant and, ongoing exposure to violence. In addition to other hardships like economic insecurity. But, this link between mental health and, working in recent years, but we felt like there's this, this extra thing that's like power differentials between men and women. It goes across cultures, it's, international. It has to do with the social and political context where, violence against women is taking place. So we really took a lot of inspiration from feminist scholars who are, stressing the importance of looking at women's lived experiences and, really viewing these experiences as embodied. So, we see how social position interacts with women's embodied experiences of violence, and these also intersect with race, class, ethnicity, religion, etc. And this literature also looks at how women's bodies are exploited under capitalism and how this is linked to gender oppression, as well as global disparities of wealth. So we looked at these contributions from these feminist scholars, and we use this term embodied trauma to sort of capture how women workers' experiences of violence is yes, linked to work and working conditions. It's also tied to systems of gender domination and power, and these are embodied. They're carried in the body and the mind long term. We use this term garment industrial trauma complex to really call attention to, the role of these global buyers, global apparel brands, and how they directly support these, gendered systems of discipline and violence that women workers are experiencing, and to show how these systems are really upheld by this immense corporate greed. I mean, we see how these buyers or brands are placing the importance on profits above anything else. And, these asymmetric power relationships between brands in the global north and suppliers in, production countries in the global south. So, we see that these women workers are really finding their lives are shaped by these dynamics in powerful ways. So, just to put it briefly, states are competing for foreign investment by offering low wages, policies that favor flexible production, weak enforcement of labor laws, and then employers are trying to get the most out of workers for the lowest cost by, bringing down wages and using gender-based violence in the workplace to discipline the workforce and speed up the work process, as others have mentioned. So what we see is like this verbal abuse, physical violence, sexual harassment in the workplace. And then, our research showed that during the pandemic, these were worsened. And, because the intensification of work and economic insecurity, these, all increased vulnerability. Health and safety in factories is generally very bad. And the pandemic increased these health risks even more. We saw more instances of fainting, exhaustion, illness, increased accidents. So, and this also combined with the embodied trauma that, that I mentioned earlier, this is kind of how we view, in so many words, the garment industrial trauma complex. So yeah, I hope that was clear.
Thank you, Ashley, for helping us understand how violence against women workers is not only linked to work and working conditions, but is also related to women's interaction with systems of power and gender domination, and is also carried in the mind and physical body of women workers, having both long-term and deep impacts, both individually as well as collectively. And thank you, Ashley, for that important response. With this, we are closing this discussion on the impact of the pandemic and brand practices during it on Gbbh in garment supply chains. If you have any questions, do put it on the chat. We will come back to it. I now want to move to the third and final part of this session, which is to discuss the urgent actions which are required to prevent and remediate Gbbh in garment supply chains. I want to go back to Ashmita for this. Ashmita, some very important recommendations have been shared in the report, A Stitch in Time, Save None. And it tells us, how we can prevent and remediate Gbbh in garment supply chains. Can you elaborate on these recommendations and tell us why they need to be urgently implemented in supply chain? Ashmita, can you hear us? Ashmita. Okay. Well, we'll give Ashmita a couple of minutes to join. I think she has poor connectivity, and we can move to the next question. I will come back to Ashmita. My last question actually goes to Ashley. Ashley, can you tell us how convention, ILO conventions, particularly the ILO Convention 190, which is a convention on violence and harassment at workplaces. Can you tell us how this convention helps us in this struggle against gender-based violence in supply chains?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so it's an important step. I mean, it's C190. It's the first international labor standard to really lay out a gender-inclusive approach that addresses violence in the world of work, and along with measures to end gender-based violence. And so it includes things like addressing risks associated with discrimination, unequal power relationships, occupational health and safety. And these would apply to all workers, including temporary workers, home-based workers, apprentices, contract workers, all of that. And then, it really extends beyond the workplace to, commutes and migration for employment. And it's really, it's recognizing the link between domestic violence and the world of work, and this kind of, connection to the world of work and, regulations and policies that, not only deal with labor, but also govern things like non-discrimination and migration. So, yeah, I mean, if ratified, it can really serve as a tool, as one tool for women workers and their organizations to really, demand that their workplaces are free from, physical, psychological, sexual violence, all forms of violence, including economic harm. Which is, another thing that's important to reiterate is that, the C-190 and recommendation 206, they recognize economic harm as a form of gender-based violence. And this is, really important because it gives us some language to work with in terms of, the harm caused by poverty level wages, wage theft, economic insecurity, and so on. I think I'll stop there. Thanks, Nandita.
Thanks, Ashley, for that response. I think Ashley raised some important points. Our countries must ratify C-190 and brands must support it, and they must use it as a guideline because it provides a roadmap on how businesses can make sure that practices do not create the economic violence which we saw during the pandemic, which pushes women workers into other forms of violence in factories, homes, and communities. I want to see if Ashmita has joined us, and if you can respond to the question we had just asked. Ashmita, we were just asking, can you tell us a little bit more about the recommendations in this report? You're muted. You're muted, Ashmita. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Okay. So brands must be mandated to identify and remediate GBVH across their supply chains through liability incorporated into their manufacturing contracts with suppliers. And this commitment must not only comply with national legislations in production countries, but must be designed to overcome legislative and enforcement gaps as well. And brands must make concrete commitments to understanding, identifying, and also addressing risk factors for GBVH across the supply chains, especially, like I already said, economic harm arising from brands' purchasing practices through a ground-up approach that upholds respect for freedom of association and is led by workers and trade unions themselves. Also compensating for the gaps in employer-based social protection and services in production countries is also very, it's a necessary step towards preventing and remediating incidents of GBVH. Brands must compensate for gaps in laws and policies in production countries with regards to employer-based social protection by setting up and implementing standards for supporting women workers in their supply factories that are incorporated in manufacturing contracts. Brands must collaborate with workers and trade unions to identify and overcome these gaps in employer-based social protection and commit to sharing cost of providing support to women workers and their supply chains. Women workers' access to a guaranteed and a protected living wage is actually central to addressing widespread GBVH in the form of economic harm within and beyond garment factories catering to global garment supply chains. However, because there is no legal binding mechanisms, the promise of living wages is involuntary codes of conduct has always remained unfulfilled. And I would also like to mention the implementation of Aqua Safe Circle approach through brand agreements, which is extremely important in addressing GBVH and supplier factories. Developed by Corporate Social Responsibility, Division of Brands have failed to make any meaningful changes in the organizational culture that is required to end gender-based violence in government factories. So therefore, Aqua's safe circle approach, emerges as a transformative approach in this regards.
Thank you, Ashmita. Ashmita, you've raised the need for a multifaceted approach to address and prevent GBVH in garment supply chains. As Ashmita pointed out, we need brand accountability. We need to ensure living wages for women garment workers. We need to protect and promote women workers' rights to join trade unions and take part in collective bargaining negotiations. We need brands to contribute towards social protection flows in production countries. All of these actions are required if we really want to prevent and remediate GBVH in garment supply chains. So thank you, Ashmita, for that response. With this, we come to an end to today's discussion. Thank you to all of our panelists for providing us such a deep understanding on gender-based violence in garment supply chains, and for explaining how we can change this and use garment supply chains to promote gender justice as well as women's empowerment. I believe there are no questions. I think there are no questions for today. So I think we can close today's panel. So thank you again to the Saida Wahid Gender Initiative and to all the panelists who joined us today. Thanks a lot to the tech team, without whom we could not have done this Facebook Live. And thanks to all of our audience here for joining in this discussion. If you want to know more about Asia Floorwage Alliance's work, do visit our website, which is asia.floorwage.org, or write to us at contact@asia.floorwage.org. Thank you once again, and have a great evening, everyone. We're done, I guess.